Hello everyone, this is Shadrach ASMR, once again with a film rant, or rather, film talk. In this video, I want to talk about superhero films. Now, they've been very popular as of late, and I think I know why, the reason being that superhero films are now big blockbusters. Now, the Marvel Cinematic Universe is far more popular than the DC Cinematic Universe, and that's totally, different argument for another day, but in this instance, I'm going to tell you why the films, two reasons that I believe that superhero films are now more popular than ever. Now, let it be known that in the 90s they made they made Superman films back in the 70s and 80s, and the first two Superman films were pretty good, and the rest of them were awful. And then again they made Batman, Batman Returns, and Batman Forever in the 90s, and then the Batman film series basically went to crap with Batman and Robin, which was god-awful atrocious. I heard that the makers of that film apologized for creating such crap. Now, on the other end of the spectrum with with Marvel, they made two Marvel films, and I was going to mention something about the two Marvel films, but I got sidetracked in DC. I was like, okay, they made Marvel, and then they decided, let's make, Marvel. The Marvel films that were released in the 90s were Captain America and Fantastic Four. Captain America was released in 1990, and this is the 90s superhero films, mind you. And Fantastic Four was released in 1994. Of course, those two films tanked and were god awful, from what critics basically panned them, saying they were crap. And then all of a sudden, in the 2000s, in the early 2000s, you had the X-Men trilogy. And then from 2006, 2008, 2013, I believe, and then in the 20-teens, you had basically, various different comic book films. Like, for example, like I said, in the 2000s, the early 2000s, you had the X-Men films, and then you also had the Fantastic Four films, and you had the Spider-Man trilogy films with Mark McGuire. And then from 2006 to 2012, I believe, you had the Dark Knight series, which was a more realistic look on Batman, if you will. And then from 2008 onward, you had the Marvel Cinematic Universe, starting with the first Iron Man, which propelled Robert Downey Jr.'s film career from being basically just a drugged up has-been to now having a career revival, if you will. And going forward, you had the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which all films are interconnected. Now, the reason that the films from the 2000s onward are far more better and superior than the superhero films made back in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, and the 90s is that film technology has increased exponentially. And the sheer fact that now we can have computer-generated special effects and what have you is perhaps the reason why these films are much better and why they're much, more popular. This is one of the reasons why I believe that superhero films are perhaps doing much better. Now, in the 60s, you had the original Batman with Adam West, but that was meant to be campy, and of course, back in the 40s, you had two different distinct Batman series. One was made in World War II, the other was made in 1949, and that was basically, from the looks of it, it was pretty good in its own right. And then you had Batman 1989 version of it, and then you had like I said, the first Superman film made in 1978 with Christopher Reeves, and then you had the second one, the third one, and then the reason those films did good, and even why the original Superman show with George Reeves, and why Lois and Clark did pretty good as well in the 90s, is that they weren't trying to, make it expansive, and they weren't trying to, they did the best they could with what they had, and it was phenomenal. Even though the original Batman series was more about being campy and silly. And also the original, the 1960s Batman TV series. Basically, added a lot of things to the comics, like a skinny Alfred, and it brought back Catwoman, and there were like three different distinct cat actresses that played Catwoman. I'll put a video down there from another channel that may explain why this was so. So basically, long story short, is that film technology enabled all these great films to be created. Another, and that is, like I said, from 2000 onward, with with the first X-Men movie going onward, with the Marvel Cinematic Universe and everything like that, and all the films that were later made from DC and Marvel. Now, of course, in the 90s we had Spawn, and that was mixed reviews, but that was Image Comics. But this mainly addresses the main two competitors in the comic book industry in the way of DC and Marvel. Now, another reason that the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and to an extent the DC Cinematic Universe, is real popular now, why the films are doing good, is that pop culture, especially comic books, are now seen as something more than just something that kids would read. Pop culture has basically gained a better acceptance in the years. Pop culture, with comics and video games, are now finally being given the respect. They're finally being respected as legitimate forms of art. Back in the day, video games and comic books were seen as the lowest common denominator of entertainment. In the sense of, bleh, who cares? But now, they're being seen as legitimate source of entertainment. I must say that it's very good to finally see comics and video games are finally, taking off, like especially comics, because back in the past, people would just brush them off. It's something annoying and dumb. Now, people are going out to the theaters, now especially with, Deadpool and everything like that, and his fourth wall breaking and everything like that. And, of course, now that's another thing I'm going to address on. Is totally unrelated to the topic, is that when Dark Knight went, remember back when, the Dark Knight was released, the second Dark Knight that had Joker in it? It seemed that everyone wanted to dress up like the Joker, and I saw a lot of Jokers at Halloween. And when Birds of Prey was released, a lot of girls and a lot of women were dressing up like Harley Quinn, and when Joaquin Phoenix as the Joker came out, people were all dressing up like the Joker again, and it just it just goes to show that, popularity and what have you. But anyways, to rehash and to summarize this video, number one, comic book based films, that is, in the way of DC and Marvel, are popular because the film technology exists to create these films much better. And number two, pop culture, well, in the way of comic books, is being seen as more accepted in the general audience. Well, anyways, that's basically why these films are not popular. Anyways, this is Shadrach ASMR, signing off.